हार्टिएस्ट कॉन्ग्रेचुलेशंस टू ऑल द विनर्स। जैसा कि मित्तल जी कह रहे थे कि कोविड ने पूरी दुनिया पर अपना असर दिखाया है और ऐसी कोई इंडस्ट्री, ऐसा कोई बिजनेस नहीं है जहां हमें ये इफेक्ट्स नहीं दिखे। कुछ लोगों के लिए शायद ये उतना मुश्किल न रहा हो, पर कई लोगों पर इसने इतना असर किया कि उनके बिजनेस मॉडल, उनके बिजनेस का पूरा लैंडस्केप ही बदल गया। तो अब हमारे पास मौका है। Starting now, it is essential that small and medium businesses have a clear understanding of a post-COVID market. Joining us today for a panel discussion are some stellar minds who have steered their businesses through this crisis and will share their opinions and insights that will help you navigate this new normal. Get ready to understand the business landscape in the post-COVID era. And to introduce this illustrious panel, I would like to invite our panel moderator, Mr. Raghava Rao, Vice President Finance and India CFO, Amazon India.
Welcome everyone to Amazon's Smbhav. I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel discussion with four distinguished speakers, none of whom need any introduction. We do have Sanjiv Mehta, Chairman and CEO of Hindustan Unilever Limited, India's largest and most respected FMCG company. We have Rajesh, Magow, founder and group CEO of Makemytrip, a company that has revolutionized and digitized travel in this country. We also have two leaders from the venture capital and private equity side. We have Kawal Singh, who's founder and managing partner of Fireside Ventures. And we have Haresh Chawla, who's partner, True North, and former founder of and CEO of Viacom 18. I'm going to be speaking about a host of topics, including COVID, the economy, the policy environment, and change in customers and customer behavior. Of course, let's get started off with customers and consumer behavior. So Sanjeev, over to you first. As leader of India's most respected FMCG company and with your finger on the pulse of India's consumption economy, can you just talk to us now that it's been a year of the pandemic? What changes are you seeing in customer behavior, and specifically your assessment of how much of it is going to be sticky and how much at the end of it when customers lapse back to pre-COVID? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, if we look at it from a lens of consumer behavior, I think we have seen different aspects of behavior over the last 1 year. When the pandemic started, it was all about cocooning. Yeah, people were worried about stepping out. There was also the hard lockdown. Then there was the fetish for cleaning, disinfecting. Yeah. Then it was about immunity, strengthening your immunity, focusing on your health. And of course, there was also the environment, which resulted in a certain kind of behavior. Yeah, because people were locked up at home. So it became everything from entertainment to education to shopping. Now, if I were to look at it from a lens of first the consumer, first is as a company, we used to spend crores of rupees trying to inculcate the right behaviors when it came to cleaning and hand washing. But I think this is something which has moved up to a new level altogether. While the obsessiveness is starting to go away, but I think the good behavior are definitely going to stick because people have realized that's the right thing to be done. So goes with things like focusing on your health and immunity and being much more conscious about your fitness in a holistic way, not just the physical, but also the mental. When it comes from a lens of channel, there were two channels which stood out. One was, of course, the e-commerce, and the second was what I call as the renaissance of the humble grocer. Yeah, because of the proximity. And the modern trade, which was many of them were in big malls and where a lot of people could congregate at any point of time, they took a beating because many of them were closed. But going forward, e-commerce is bound to grow for the sheer convenience that it offers, the assortment it offers. Modern trade will bounce back, but I believe it will be more the small format stores, not the hypermarkets. And because in India, shopping is an expedition. Yeah, it is something which people go out not just for buying, but for the whole joy of experiencing. So that's bound to come back. And if I have to do a bit of crystal ball gazing, GT, which has in India over 10 million stores, and for over 100 million people, the food on the dining table comes because of GT. That is going to remain a dominant channel even 10 years from now, but it will be not as large as perhaps it is today, but it is going to be a very different GT. It will be connected stores. It will be stores where technology has come in. It will be stores where the modern science of retailing has come in. So that's the kind of changes which I see happening in the next few years. And a lot of that has been accelerated thanks to the pandemic.
Rajesh, you represent the travel and hospitality industry. Your industry has probably been hit by a tsunami, but I think there's probably been a good deal of recovery in the last few months. Would love to have your perspective on how you see customers and consumers' habits on travel, hospitality, out of home leisure shaping up in the last 12 months. And what do you think the future is going to look like?
Overall, that's sort of the evolution that happened. But like you rightly pointed out, um, for travel and hospitality and maybe dining out, was absolutely different initially. Like there was nothing, right? Because, you were like focused on dealing with the pandemic situation and worrying more about the safety and the hygiene, and then completely getting locked down, into your own respective homes as well. So initially it was pathetic. Like nobody really wanted to just go out, and right after the lockdown was announced, we were like, 95% drop in our revenue. So that tells you the story. But the interesting piece was that as it started to recover a little bit, so the unlock starting from, let's say, 1.0 to now, I don't know whether we are at 4.0 or more, we started to see that in the desire of getting out and travel coming back. Of course, it started with essential travel first. And then slowly and gradually the other segments, the consumer segments started to travel again. And then, of course, we also saw specific to leisure segment, and which is very encouraging if you really see. And that's something that tells me I'm actually always a very big believer of that, given that we've seen some of the crises and the down cycles in the past, that the public memory is really, really short. So as you see the recovery happening and things were opening up, and we saw a huge amount of pent-up demand as well, and travel by nature. I mean, at least the leisure travel by nature is a discretionary spend, as we all know, and therefore initially it was bound to be, let's cut back, and for more than one reason. But as things started to open up, and that was just confined to domestic travel largely. But I'll tell you one or two international destinations that opened up, Maldives and UAE, where because of the bubble arrangement, they ended up doing a good job between the two countries, just in terms of maintaining safety protocols. We saw serious amount of pent-up demand as well. So, something tells me that inherent desire of the consumer to experience is not going to go away. There's obviously going to be short-term setback, which we are all going through it. And I think this whole industry will take, I think 1 year is behind us, but maybe it will take another 1 year, maybe more for it to be completely sort of come to the pre-COVID level. But very interesting sort of consumer behavior that we ended up seeing. I'll just give you one more example that I think is going to probably stay as a trend as well going forward. A lot of the people actually, move to just drivable distance holidays. Just getting out and saying, okay, maybe I don't want to take a public transport or flight. Maybe I'm a little skeptical about it. I'll just pick up my own car and then, check in myself into a resort for a couple of days. And we saw more and more happening, so much so that, the nearby destination, all the hospitality, the hotels as well as the accommodation, the choco-block. So you will have long weekends and you will have people going there. But that doesn't mean, the overall travel was anywhere close to coming back. So, that was sort of an interesting consumer behavior that we saw. And that's likely to continue. So I think the larger learning that we get out of this crisis is with respect to looking at consumers at large is more that consumers tend to adapt really quickly in whatever might be the circumstance. And that we've just really seen that happening. And I think it's just playing out very nicely.
Kawal, over to you. Your company has invested in a lot of consumer goods and consumer brands. I'm pretty sure the changes that you've seen in consumer buying behavior in the last 12 months have been quite interesting. Could you talk to us about some of the trends that you see from your vantage point as a venture capital private equity investor?
Maybe I'll also build on what Sanjiv said, because obviously the theme continues for our set of brands as well. So one of the big, I would say, positive waves in favor of our brands, which are typically digital first, was the acceptance of e-commerce as a more mainstream way of of behavior. And that literally, opened up the floodgates, because, a lot of our brands have seen 3x to 5x type of growth literally over the last 12 months. And that is completely triggered by the advent of e-commerce. So, I mean, I do believe what Sanjiv said is that e-commerce will only proliferate further, because the convenience, the adoption of e-commerce has been forced upon some categories of consumers, but now it's becoming more and more a habitual thing. I think the second thing which we saw, which was quite interesting, was really the acceptance and the desire to consume more branded products. So obviously, companies like Unilever and Nestle and Procter and ITC, etc., saw the benefit of that very quickly, because people were very nervous or very shy about unbranded, unorganized, because of the same issues of hygiene and concern about what they were putting into their mouths or on their body. But that also reflected on some of our brands. And we saw that, companies like Mamaearth, companies like Kapiva, Yoga Bar, they saw some very, very interesting consumer acceptance, because they brought in a certain sensibility of branded and clean label and so on and so forth. So that was another interesting trend. And I think the last point that Sanjiv made, and I'll elaborate that a little bit, was this whole, modern trade to modernization of general trade. And I think that is really the big wave that we are most excited about. I think all brands will eventually go in some form to an omni kind of an approach. And having a network of millions of retailers who are better connected, more modernized, more accessible, is going to change the milieu for all of us. And extending that into the small town India is the other big opportunity we are seeing. Some of our brands, which were very millennial, very urban focused, saw some almost automatic demand. Companies like Boat, for example, they have seen some tremendous opportunity coming from small town India. And again, digitization, more adoption of e-commerce, these trends really helped it. So I would say all in all, it was a great time to almost, build these new age brands. And our belief is that this trend will continue, and we will see some very exciting brands coming out of India and potentially going global as well.
Haresh, over to you. In your articles and some of the notes that you've written, you talked about 2020 being the year of the reset. You also said what we have seen in the last 12 months indicates that there are new winners and new losers. So from your vantage point, what do you have to share with us on this new normal?
I think, if you pull back a bit and you see what started in 2016, actually, that, suddenly our telecom prices due to Jio dropped by 95% almost. And that led to a wave of, 600 odd million internet streamers, I call them. And that's been the situation in the market for 4 or 5 years, that Indian consumption of data by Indians is the highest in the world at 12 GB a month. So that wave that set off in 2016 didn't really lead to the creation. It led to creation of a consumption of content economy, not a internet economy. But the pandemic changed that completely. So I think what we are seeing now is a result of all that work of the last half decade really now playing out, because customers now are willing internet transactors and not just streamers. So the smartphone is no longer just a small entertainment device in their hand. They use it for transactions, they use it for information, they use it for payments, they use it to buy things, they use it as their first point now. I think we'll see that even playing out even as we go forward. Their first point of discovery will shift from the real world to the smartphone now. And that wave has taken off in the West and in China, but that hadn't taken off here. So that, I think, that the fundamental difference that the physical world will manifest itself fully on the smartphone. And you can see young people even leaving their homes without their wallets completely. They are completely comfortable going out for a drink or a party, only carrying their phone. They are comfortable that their payment systems will work. They can give money to each other. They can spend in an outlet. They can buy anything they want using a payment wallet like Google Pay or Phone Pay. So I think that fundamental difference is a subterranean thing that's happening that is going to impact every business, because the first point of discovery will be digital for a business. Either you'll discover it through a social medium or you'll directly search it on Google. But it's rare now that you'll be able to do a good business by not existing digitally fully. So that's one fundamental thing. The second thing that changed is that the whole economy became from the internet economy in India was a push economy, and that has become a pull economy. So really, what really happens with that is that the behavioral shift in consumers is that they are now willing to pay for the services that the internet offers them. No longer it's just pumping them with discounts. They're willing to pay for delivery. They're willing to pay for convenience. They're willing to pay for the access that same-day delivery gives them. So I think that's a fundamental shift that at the underlying level makes it economically viable now, much more so than before, to build up an internet or a digital interface for your business. So I think those two factors, if you put them together, that the transactors have come in and push has become pull. And that fundamentally forces every company to rewire. And that's how the winners and losers get decided. Every company now needs to have its digital avatar, polished and as good as its physical avatar. It is no longer sensible. Of course, many companies will fail at this transition. I mean, that's something we've seen globally. It is not easy to bring this digital DNA into your organization. I'm sure many of us have run businesses where it's been impossible to do that. But clearly, the pandemic will force a kind of separation between companies that will learn to become digital natives and the companies that will fail at doing that. So that this is I think fundamental at a large level, at a economy level. That's the thing that's happening. At a third level, what's really going to happen, I'm going to finish with that point, is the productivity, the micro level improvements in productivity that we've seen across the board with the internet will start playing themselves out over the next few years. Everything has become much simpler, much easier, because everybody is connected and they're using the internet. From micro payments to purchases to whether you want to get a passport, you want to use Aadhaar to do a transaction, all of that layer is now releasing a productivity and efficiency in the economy, which is happening at a micro level, but all of that will gather together and drive us into virtually a new economic future, in a sense.
I take your message as the shift from transaction to shopping and from push to pull and overall improvement in productivity and ubiquity of digital services. Let's now talk about some of the lessons that we have learned as corporate India in the last 12 months. And Sanjiv, we'll start with you. You've spoken during the crisis on the role of leadership, leading with empathy. You talked about communities and serving customers, and of course, supply chain. Now, with the benefit of hindsight in the last 12 months, what do you think corporate India got right in the last 12 months? And what do you think we could have done better? And also from your vantage point as head of HUL, what did you see around us?
Yeah, so what I'll do is also intertwine a bit of the society. Yeah, I think the most important bit is putting compassion at the center of leadership. Yeah, very often we have defined leadership traits as someone who's an eloquent speaker, a strategic thinker, but we have never associated compassion with leadership. Yeah. I think this is one big change that has come in. And when I talk about compassion, it is not just for the society at large, but first and foremost for your employees. That's how it starts. Yeah, so that's one very big thing. The second important bit is that, unlike what many people say, this wasn't a black swan event. This was predicted and it was predictable. And is it the end of ambiguity and chaos? Certainly not. Yeah, as Tom Friedman rightly said, there's a herd of black elephants stampeding across the landscape, and we might come across many such kind of situations going forward, whether it is water crisis, whether it is climate action, climate change, or what have you. So the important bit is being what I call as the brutal optimist, which in many ways is a Churchillian paradox. Yeah, blood, sweat, toil, and tears, but ultimately you shall prevail. I think it's very important for leaders not to shy away from the crisis, but to tell exactly what the scenario is. But then also, people crave for leadership during this time. So you need to be able to show them what's the way out. The other important bit is that over the last few years, organizations have gone for efficiency at a pretty high level. And whenever you have this kind of a scenario, and you can never ever predict all kinds of crises, then you need to be adaptive. Now, adaptive means, as opposed to operating at a very high level of efficiency, you need to have an inbuilt tolerance, spare capacity. Yeah. Only with adaptation would come in resilience, your ability to bounce back. Yeah. So you will have to determine, every corporation, where in your value chain you drive for efficiency and where in your value chain you build for resilience. Yeah. So this would be a bit different thinking. The other important bit is people have been talking about speed and agility. But one has pondered around, speed generally people look and measure in terms of time dimension, but it doesn't really work that way. When you really break it open, speed works on three platforms. One is your ability to recognize a problem or an opportunity. Second is, once you've recognized the problem or an opportunity, then it comes to a decision speed. Yeah. How quick are you to act on it? Take a decision on it. And last but not the least is the execution speed. Only when you have all these three elements work in a synchronistic manner in an organization that you can pivot, adapt to adjacent categories, or bring about new speed in the company. Linked to speed and linked to what I call as the recognition speed is what I call as sense making. When you work in a chaotic and ambiguous world, when you don't have perfect information, you have to have a trait of putting disparate data together and being able to drive sense out of it. Now, this is again will require organizational competencies. Yeah, it's not something which can happen. Of course, huge amount of data and analytics help the cause, but making sense out of that was something which this chaos has taught us. And then very importantly, one has realized that the days of being a lone rider are over. We have realized today that even a nation today cannot solve this problem on its own, even the richest nation. Yeah. And this problem cannot be solved anywhere unless it is solved everywhere. Otherwise, there will be mutations. It will spread to other places. And so the days of lone rider are over. This is a bit contradictory to the fact that the world was moving away from globalization. Yeah. But if you look at the way the vaccines were developed, a normal vaccine takes anywhere between 4 to 5 years to develop, sometimes much more. But the ability to develop vaccine in one place, do the trials in another place, manufacture in another country has happened because I would say we have again started looking at it. Can we go back to the principles of globalization and solve the big intractable problems facing humanity? So there are a huge amount of learnings coming out of it. It would be important. A learning organization, a smart company will imbibe and build it into the organization, whereas many companies would not be able to do that. And last but not the least, Raghav, is living your purpose. And living your purpose is best manifested, if I may take a few 30 seconds to give you an example. This was in the beginning of last year, the crisis pandemic. It was about April, May, when we were all ensconced in our homes, but our factories were running because we manufacture soaps, sanitizer, disinfectants. And I used to do calls with the factory teams because they were the guy and the sales guy. They were the guy out in the open, still working, stepping out of their homes. And I remember speaking to a factory worker कि आपको कैसा लग रहा है? हम घर में बैठे हैं, हम सेफ हैं, लेकिन आप रोज घर से निकलते हैं और फैक्ट्री में जाते हैं, आपको कैसा लगता है? तो बोलता है कि सर, मैं यहाँ पे आता हूँ साबुन बनाने जिससे देश की रक्षा हो. That's purpose.
Awesome.
So whether it is an individual purpose or an organizational purpose, that would be your true north.
Fascinating, Sanjiv. That's truly inspiring to listen to those softer perspectives on leadership. Rajesh, what's been your personal experience? You spoke earlier saying your revenues, at least in the initial part of the lockdown, were decimated to about 95% of what they were. That must have been a truly difficult time for your team. How did you, as a leader of that organization, having survived many crises before, lead through that? What were your lessons? Would love to hear them.
Sure. I mean, and like you said, it was a mega crisis. It was actually a mother of all the crises that we had seen in the past, not even remotely close to anyone what we had seen in the past. Of course, when you go through any crisis, there is a tremendous amount of learning, and we had few in the past. And, we obviously, you tend to apply those and use those when you have another a crisis at your hand. But this was of a different magnitude, clearly. And the experience was crazy, and I was just it was fascinating to hear what Sanjiv was saying. I mean, clearly a pro on leadership talk, but let me tell you just some of my experience personally at Makemytrip and how the whole thing went away. I guess the real immediate issue at hand at that point in time was, given that it was sort of bolt from the blue, came from somewhere, maybe could have been predicted, not predicted, etc., but just hit us. I don't think people anticipated, and people did not anticipate this sort of impact immediately. Although we had some sense of it coming from China, given that we had some association there, but we saw, maybe we were a little bit more educated about it than many others. But clearly nobody really see the serious impact of it. Nobody really anticipated that it's going to be a complete country lockdown. And then I remember talking to some of the peer group, CEOs in the Western world. They were like completely surprised and shocked that the whole country was locked down, a country like the size of India. So it was completely a very different situation. So on the ground, the situation was basically twofold. As in the hindsight, if you really see and do the analysis, one was the immediate crisis and how do you deal with the crisis management, right? So, I mean, and there, at least my personal learning is that you don't have to, actually there's no real room for thinking there, you have to act. So you have to immediately get into action, get into execution mode, because, if there is a time when people look up to you and look up to leaders, it's the crisis time. Probably the most, right? Because that is the time that you have to demonstrate that. In a steady state scenario, of course, you would be doing, and I'm sure there would be expectations from leaders, but during crisis time, it's very, very different, because everybody is insecure, everybody is worried, especially our sector, which was like literally decimated. And therefore, what you needed to do was to basically how quickly can you just get your thoughts together and get into action and first address your people. And you know, and Sanjiv gave an example of his calls with the factory workers. I can tell you, I can't even count the number of Zoom calls that we would have done with the people, because there, I think the softer aspects have to be extremely, extremely important. You know, when it comes to the leadership behaviors that you have to demonstrate. And when I say softer aspects specifically, you would see, you know, you will have to have a different level of transparency. You know, you got to be transparent, you got to be upfront, you got to be just straight and telling the bad news. And how you tell that bad news could be very different. And that is where the compassion comes into play. And let's say if there are some harsh decisions, and I don't think there would be any business who would have probably not got into taking unfortunate and harsh decisions, and we were no sort of exception as well. Of course, these are very tough decisions, but our focus was that was on the how part. You know, how can we try and go out of the way to soften the blow, if you will? If you had to, let's say, had to do some right sizing, if you had to have pay cuts, how are we going to set the tone by leading by example? You know, can it start from the top first if it was supposed to be the pay cuts, let's say, or any other bad news for the people? So, you know, the whole focus was more addressing the people issues first before doing anything else. Of course, there was one crisis team which was also sort of looking at the P&L management and the cost management and the rest of it, because that's like, you know, you couldn't have not done that. But there was a lot of effort that went into actually making sure the team is secured and team gets the right message on two counts. One was the immediate crisis management coming across, saying that you are in control. And by the way, that aspect is super critical as well. You can't just not be appearing to be in control. See, you may be going through whatever, you know, in terms of in your own mind, the level of stress and all that. You won't, I mean, you have absolutely no liberty to be able to just show it to people, because that defeats the whole purpose, right? So you have to deal with that, and you have to just, in front of everyone, you have to be absolutely strong and tall, and then be able to give that comfort. So that's on the immediate crisis. But then the other very important thing, and that I think makes the big difference, and therefore, you know, as I've been just calling it, that we had a dual track strategy to deal with this scenario. One was to manage the crisis, because that is here and now and what you have to immediately act on. And two, what is that strategy that will make sure that you focus on certain opportunity areas, and as you come out of the crisis, will make you even more stronger. So that's sort of a little bit more long-term thinking. And I think the expectation of people and all stakeholders is on both. You all hands on deck could be on managing crisis, but that's short term, right? Because that's here and now, and then you have to do it. But how are you going to just make sure that you also are not losing sight of the opportunities during this crisis, as well as keeping the long-term thinking intact, and not necessarily, you know, get everyone bogged down with saying that, you know, we don't even know where we are going from a long-term standpoint, right? So I think that was also equally important. So we had these two parallel tracks that was running. Easier said than done, you know. Now looking back, you could say, you know, because it's just almost what today, you know, it's about 1 year anniversary already of the lockdown. So 4 quarters, you can look back and you can say, okay, fair enough. Maybe we, you know, there has been tremendous amount of learning. Maybe we ended up doing few things right as well. But to me, these were two very important things. One, make sure that you keep your long-term strategy intact, and make sure that people sort of look up to that, and they stay focused, that they don't completely lose, you know, sight of that. And there we had the advantage of one part of our business, if you will. See, one part of our business is the travel industry that got hit very badly. But the other part of our business is, or really the foundation of our business is the online travel. So it's basically the e-commerce. So the e-commerce, there was going to be inflection at some point in time. Haresh mentioned and gave you all the data. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. If there was any silver lining that we saw in this whole thing, was this whole offline to online momentum picking up even more. And it's going to, I mean, travel is not going to be any exception, because there's going to be perhaps a lag effect. But in terms of just buying behavior, that was going in our favor. So therefore, you know, bring in that positive set of news, and let people focus on thinking more positive rather than just completely sort of getting bogged down about it. I guess maybe the last point that I would also mention on this particular topic is that you have to make extraordinary effort to keep people busy during crisis. And it worked out like wonders for us. And I can tell you as much as that the level of productivity in the first couple of quarters, during when there was hardly any business that was happening, was many-fold higher than what we used to achieve in steady state, because we were able to bring in the purpose, in terms of just bringing in all those projects we may not have paid attention to, given that the business as usual brings in huge amount of, like a long list of projects pipeline all the time, and you're not necessarily able to do justice on all of them. And there were many of them opportunities from our point of view, and we said, okay, guys, let's just get together and focus on these projects, and that kept them busy, so that they are also thinking that it's not necessarily, it's like doomsday scenario all the time, right? I mean, and we are not able to recover from it. It helps you sort of focus and stay busy and stay positive. And I think, and that sort of helped us as well, and probably keep their mind away from the crisis bit while we do the heavy lifting, or a particular sort of crisis management task force does the heavy lifting on managing the crisis per se. But everybody else is just sort of busy and saying, okay, fair enough. It's like any other down cycle. It happens with every industry, and we'll come out of it stronger. So if you bring in all of this together, and there are many messages in this, I guess, but if you bring in the softer aspects and you bring in the stronger and the resilient aspects of leadership, and marry the two together, at least from my point of view, that was our learning on the ground, that could possibly help many other people as well.
Thanks, Rajesh. Kawal, Rajesh and Sanjiv both spoke about leadership from the vantage point of large companies. In your role, you deal with captains of many small and medium businesses, many startups, which probably don't have the reliability or the solidity of a large balance sheet with them. How did they cope with this crisis? What did you observe uh, as different patterns and different behaviors of leaders of small businesses who were hit by the pandemic?
So certainly, Raghav, I think the the challenge was completely different, right? I mean, this was about survival, and in many cases, we had situations where companies had to worry about, how are they going to manage the next paycheck and the next salaries and so on. Do you have to let people go? Uh, I think the one big learning for me, and I've always been a huge admirer of entrepreneurs, and the risk they take, and the way they take on the challenge, like nobody else does, in my view, is the resilience that we saw from every entrepreneur, every, the compassion and the resilience to almost say that, we will not let this allow us to, do something completely artificial. We don't want to let go of people. So I've seen examples of companies, where the CEOs took 100% salary cuts, but still kept their entire team on some level of sustenance wages, even though there was no business, and so on and so forth. So I would say that, the most heartwarming stories for us were how the CEO stepped up and almost took ownership of the situation. The second piece, which again both Sanjeev and Rajesh alluded to, but I think it kind of accelerated or came out in a very big way for us, was this whole element of jugaad. Again, entrepreneurs are by nature extremely agile and very experimentative and willing to pivot multiple times as required. And we saw some amazing examples of our companies taking on some amazing pivots around the businesses, because if this is not working, let's try something else. And I think we were joking before the panel started about the demand for the uppers and the bottoms apparel. We have a company called Fable Street who launched a work from home collection, and it was like more loungy bottoms and more formal tops, and it really started showing some results. So I think the innovation, the spirit of jugaad, the ability to almost like the famous saying, right, never let a good crisis go waste, I think that came out in spades. And the last part, which I really want to highlight, is just the ecosystem came together wonderfully. I mean, I can tell you, Sahil Barua from delivery called me up and said, listen, there is a huge issue with logistics, especially in that May, June, July timeframe. And they were totally busy because every large company was like scrambling, including yourself, to find the right way of delivering the products and so on and so forth. But he said, Kawal, I know the young companies are struggling. How can I help with my logistics, my warehousing capabilities to your companies? Hari Menon from Big Basket saying, we have seen tripling of sales, but we don't want to ignore these smaller companies. How can we help them? So I think the world, if I can be very optimistic and almost philosophical about it, I'm really hoping that the world comes out better as a fallout of this crisis or as an outcome of this crisis, and more caring, like Sanjiv said, more purposeful. And that's really my net summary of how well the entrepreneurial community came together to fight it together.
Haresh, with you, we'll zoom out a little bit. You've seen what happened in the country. The government sort of grappled with saving lives and saving livelihoods, and it's not an easy balance to maintain. From what you've seen, what did corporate India get right in the last 12 months? And what do you wish or what do you think could have been even better?
Yeah, so Raghav, the way to look at it, like it's a shock, and the shock, galvanized some companies into action. So you saw some companies really, pull their teams together, and make moves to actually gain from the crisis. And we've seen that in a lot of sectors where, this idea that you can play to your strengths in a crisis because you have the cash flows, you have the balance sheet, you have the brand. There is a flight to safety among consumers. And if you're able to now even hop onto the digital bandwagon, so I think a lot of this, you will have to look at how the shock is dealt with by a company, and that I think defined a lot of what happened over the last 12 months. Several companies clearly, it's almost like the tide runs out and who's standing naked. So there are companies who were adapted, they got their supply chains together, they galvanized their teams. And focused on actually delivering. And we saw a lot of that in the packaged food business, for example, where the demand just ripped through the roof and companies then absolutely went with both hands and grabbed the opportunity. We're seeing the numbers today from those companies. So they've used this opportunity to actually cement their market position and grow them. Equally, if company had lower market share and had a smaller market share and had a, let's say, lazier competitor, they again have managed to change the order of the pecking order in several businesses. But equally, you saw several companies just come under severe pressure, which is because if you are going into the pandemic, if you were not a strong business with strong balance sheet and strong fundamental and strong team, clearly the pandemic it's going to wipe you out. So a lot of inefficient businesses have been culled. So that's a dynamic we'll see now playing out over the next few years. That market shares of several firms will go up, even though markets have shrunk. Several markets shrank through the pandemic, but market shares of several firms have gone up. There are new competitors that have come into the market, and a lot of blurring of boundaries between businesses have happened. In a sense, you'll find that today, smaller brands are actually using their position to, Mama Earth, for example, Kanwal, that's a great example of how a company has grown 4-5x and really is ready to, in the next few years, start threatening much larger competitors. A company like Nykaa, for example, again, massive growth. So you're seeing companies pick up segments that are strong with. Moment you had engagement with a customer and a personal relationship and a brand, you were able to supply much more than a brand sitting in a store, which did not have any relationship or any electronic means of communication with the customer. So I think that's another fundamental, that's another dynamic that's playing out. It will become imperative for many companies in this country to develop digital channels to have a relationship with consumers, which the startups essentially are born having. It's in their DNA. So that shift is something that we'll see, and we are in the middle of the journey actually. I think luckily the economy has bounced back much better. Though even now we are seeing a second wave probably, but the fact is the economy has bounced back much more. But the fundamentals of how to win in this new world have changed.
Sanjiv, the policy environment is something we're going to talk about now. The policy environment has changed in the last 12 months. And specifically, my question to you as leader of a multinational, which is of course very local in nature. You spoke earlier about globalization. We now hear Atmanirbhar Bharat sort of shaping the way we look at economic policy in this country. We also hear a lot of buzz about local, vocal for local, and a lot of emphasis on local supply chains. Your company had taken a position as part of a global supply chain. How have you adapted to this particular shift? And do you think globalization is now behind us, or is this just a phase? What advice do you have when you look at what's happening, that globalization versus localization shift that we see in the last few months?
If you look at even before the pandemic, there was a step away from globalization as many countries were becoming more parochial in nature. If we look back that last 3 decades, more wealth has been created than ever before. More people have been lifted out of poverty than ever before. And I would attribute one of the reasons is to globalization. So I'm a big believer in globalization. I also believe that there is no dichotomy between globalization and Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar Bharat, so when even this was announced, I had no worries at all. Because I believe that at the crux, what India is aspiring is to have a bigger stake in the global value chain. That's what India is looking at. At the same time, India needs to be very clear that in what segments of the economy you want to bring in global scale, and where in some places you have a natural advantage, and in some places you will create an advantage so that you can compete on cost, service, quality, and innovation. So I think from that perspective, I carry no worries at all. We have been in the country for over 80 years. And one of the philosophy that Raghava has held us in very good stead is that as a company, as a subsidiary of a multinational, you need to align yourself with the national agenda. Yeah, that's very important because any sovereign nation will have its priorities and you need to align. And once you do that, then you get the love and affection of the consumers. I'll give you a couple of examples. Way back, you would be knowing, Raghav, the history of HUL as much as anyone else. When India was going through a serious forex crisis for import substitution, HUL went into fertilizer business, chemical business. Yeah, it was not our core competency, but the entire intent was that we need to step up to help the nation. If you look at last 10 years, we thought that if we have to step up and help the country with water management. So we've been working in about 6,000 villages, democratizing water management, both on the demand and supply side. And we have created a water potential of 1.3 trillion liters, which is enough to meet the drinking water needs of the entire country for a year. It's still a drop in the nation, but it's not something which was forced on us. Yeah, but you can well say that there was an element of enlightened self-interest. Yeah, because if there is no water, we won't be able to sell anything from soaps, shampoos, tea, coffee, or anything of that kind. But at the end of the day, we could have well avoided getting into this area for many years. But we thought that we have to align ourselves with the national priority and be a part of the solution. So from that perspective, if you bring in a lens, then for any multinational operating in India, which is a fabulously attractive market, and there should be no worries at all.
Kawal, Atmanirbhar Bharat and small scale, small and medium businesses and startups, how big an opportunity is it? And how exactly does it affect the small and medium businesses in this country?
Honestly, Raghav, for us, very parochially, I think this is a great initiative. I think we have always had this dichotomy of India being such a large consumption market with very few branded plays and, led by many different factors, which, like Haresh said, are being challenged and, almost opened up because of the digital, infrastructure building out. So for us, the fact that, we can bring in not only scores but hundreds of new brands, and encourage an ecosystem where more and more local brands proliferate. They understand local consumer, local insights. I think to us that is a huge opportunity that has opened up. Infrastructure is building out, consumers are looking for choices, and the government is supporting some of these initiatives. So at one level, I would say it's an amazingly opportunistic moment for brands like the ones we deal with. On the second hand, obviously this whole focus on promoting local production, of trying to make supply chain, like Sanjiv said, for the global markets is another very interesting thing, because our businesses are extremely fast in terms of innovation, rapid prototyping, a very lean inventory management. So the entire ability to have a system which can be really propelled into a very fast turnaround kind of opportunity. Currently some of our company like boats, for example, source largely from China. And that becomes a huge bottleneck. You have to plan 3 months in advance, and you have to almost plan completely differently than you could if you had the opportunity to do that in India. And the last piece, which I personally believe and am most excited about, is the opportunity not only to build great brands for India, but Indian brands which can actually take the story global. And we are seeing in very small measures, brands like Vadam and Ayurveda Experience, who have actually built meaningful businesses in, almost mainstream consumption areas like the US and Europe and so on. So there are multifold, almost vectors that I am seeing as positives from Atmanirbhar Bharat, and actually it's a huge positive for our brands and for our business.
Rajesh, your company has been a big beneficiary of digitization. In fact, you've digitized the act of physical travel in terms of discovery, booking, reviews, etc. Looking back and looking around you on what's happening in terms of digitization, what's your expectation on the policy side? What do you think is working well? And when you see what can be better in the country?
So let me tell you what is working well. And I have the sort of advantage of seeing what was there 10 years ago. So one can sort of do the comparison of 15 years ago. I think what is working beautifully and largely been driven from everywhere, including the central government, is the payments ecosystem on the digitization side. I remember the time when we used to have one payment gateway system, and I'm sure Haresh would bail me out on that. Way back in, let's say, 2000, and maybe 2000 was just very early, but even 2005. And from there, where the evolution that we've seen in front of our own eyes, and last 5 years sort of powered by smartphone as a preferred device, not only the overall digital multiple options of making payments, let's say, and then UPI, and then we are, actually already have a, NPCI sort of parallel companies coming up and so on, right? So huge improvement in overall digital payment ecosystem, I would say. That is one big thing that has happened. And then the second one is, which we were, a lot of the e-commerce companies were sort of struggling earlier, that we used to have a bandwidth related issue, right? I mean, I'll tell you, till 2010 when we IPO'd, the broadband number of users used to be 10 million, whereas the overall internet users used to be 120 million. And now for the last, thanks to the telecom sector as well as smartphones and the bandwidth improving from a telecom last mile standpoint, now pretty much everybody's that problem is gone. And then that has been a huge sort of improvement that has happened on the bandwidth side, because these are the foundations of the e-commerce businesses, if you will. Because if you don't have that, then the experience is going to be very bad, and they're going to be all kinds of issues. So these are like great sort of amount of improvements that we've seen over the past I would say about a decade or so, where I think we can continue to keep building on these. And this is definitely this inflection, the COVID giving sort of inflection point on consumer behavior fast changing into, from an offline buying behavior to an online behavior is also going to help us. Where I think we, specifically on policy making specific to the digital world, that we need to see is where the noise is these days, right? And there I think we need to be very, very careful. I do see a lot of the efforts being made, but I at the same time also see huge amount of gaps also that you see. So for instance, draft e-commerce policy. So when we are looking at an overall e-commerce as an industry, the good news is that there's a lot of attention being now paid to this industry, which wasn't the case a few years ago. That's great news. But where we need to be super careful is that we actually go deeper into understanding the various aspects of the business, whether it is about data security, whether it's about privacy, whether it is about different segments who are operating on in the e-commerce space, because there are different sort of policies and different aspects of the policies that are, whether it is a foreign direct investment policy, or there is a consumer side of policies and the laws that are already in place, and then there is the technology, the data security side, and then there is a bunch of indirect taxes and indirect taxes laws and all of that. When you try to bring all of them together, and you say that, okay, e-commerce industry needs to be looked at it differently, I think so far we are messing it up a little bit. If you really see, at a just prima facie, for instance, the guidance note that came for, and I was almost very surprised seeing the full base of it itself. I mean, the premise of it itself. The consumers are the consumers. Now, consumers are buying online or buying offline are the consumers. And therefore, if the consumers we already have laws and the protections under the law for the consumers, for Indian consumers buying offline right now, because that guidance was saying now e-commerce consumers will be protected differently. And here's the guidance note on that. I was baffled with that. I didn't really understand the whole thing. I'm saying, it doesn't really change either the need or the protection that a consumer need. Effectively, there would be nuances. Of course, you will have to be careful on some of those nuances that you might have to add, but fundamentally, it's not very different. I mean, conceptually, it's not very different. And that's just one example of that. And similarly, I think we just need to be careful. And therefore, the good news again is deliberations are happening. And if we are able to make sure that we are able to come up with absolutely fair and objective guidelines, and also, another, I think one of the important aspects that we need to keep in mind, and a lot of people have been talking about it, industry experts, policymakers and all, is about level playing field. I think we just need to understand the level playing field. In what context are we trying to say that? So level playing field could be between now, I mean, unfortunately, it could also become an online player and an offline player. Earlier, the narrative used to be, let's say the foreign based companies, the online companies, and we had those issues that there would be nuances where there may not be level playing field, like a second factor authentication as an example, that Indian registered companies will have to go through a second factor authentication on payments. Maybe the foreign nationals were not for the longest time had to go through the second factor authentication, and I call it as a level playing field. Good example of a level playing field. But then fast forward, and if we try to say that now, let us start making a distinction between, or we need to think about deeper, that how do I create a level playing field between an e-commerce player or an online player, and mind you, basically that player is also underneath the platform is doing the same product, selling the same product and services that the offline player would be selling. How do I, it's complex. It's not easy, mind you, it's complex, and therefore it needs to be thought through. I think that environment, we need to be a little bit more careful now, hoping that we don't end up taking any regressive steps, which are sort of not really well thought through. I don't doubt the intentions here, but I think it's just a lot more time and resources, investment that has to go into it in terms of understanding, getting the understanding right. And then to be able to. So, because all of those things then end up creating huge amount of distraction and noise, and the narratives change, and then everybody gets insecure and gets distracted, and which is, I don't think is the intention at all. right? So that aspect, I think we need to be, as a country, as industry players, as working with the associations, working with the government at all level, we should make sure that we get that right. And I think it's a joint responsibility. Is not responsibility of one particular sort of society forums or government for that matter. And that's the only thing. Otherwise, I think in terms of just infrastructure building and strategically thinking about digitization in the country, and there are many examples, as you know, I think that hump we've crossed, which was, therefore, there is that we are, I think as a country, we are on our way in terms of just continuously keep thinking about infrastructure upgrade. And that's great news. But these are the only aspects I think that we should be a little bit more careful so that it doesn't kind of take us back few steps after having taken many steps forward.
Sanjiv, I can't resist asking you this since you spoke about the softer aspects of leadership. What does the future of workspaces look like? Will it be back to office, or will people continue to work from home? And what does the future look like? And more importantly, as a leader, how do you inspire people when you're just connecting with them over Zoom meeting?
First is, I think, like many people started writing an obituary of a physical workspace. That's wrong. Similarly, if you expect that classical 40 hours or 8 hours every day, 5 day or 6 day, that's also bound to change. And so there would be, I believe, thanks to the pandemic, a much better balance. Yeah, there'll be some jobs which can best be done and you don't need to come. And if the employee is happy, then they can work from home. But there are many people, at the end of the day, human beings are social animals. There is a lot called something called social capital. You don't want to destroy that. And, in our place, we have created a fabulous work environment and people love to come. So they want the offices to open up. At the same time, I used to travel to UK twice a month. And since the pandemic, as the executive board of Unilever, we have been meeting more frequently than ever before. So again, there is going to be a balance. And I don't think we are going to, sorry, Rajesh, we're not going to travel mindlessly. There will be travel. Yeah. And, I miss travel now. On the way to London, I would finish reading a book. And but it is going to be a much better balance, I would believe.
Okay.
Yeah, which will enhance the effectiveness of the organization as well as the employees. And I think that would be another good which would come out of this crisis.
Haresh, I'll let you have the last word. You've spoken about this year and last year being a little bit of a Y2K moment for India and the Indian economy. If you were to look at it through that lens, what do you think the next 10 years is going to look like? And if you were to go back in time in the future, what do you think would change for India? And what would India in 2030 look like? This is what we've seen in the pandemic.
Yeah, long question. I'll try and give you a short answer. No, so I think just remember that in the Y2K, near 2000, India ended up exporting brawn and not brains. I think this time the opportunity is fundamentally different at two levels. One is that we are probably the most digitally savvy consumer market in the world now outside China. I mean, we have better infrastructure, better mobile smartphone usage, better ability of the startups to use the capacity of the smartphone well than even the West or Europe actually. So that gives us a edge actually as we develop software for the Western world. So one is that the demand for digital transformation is now across the globe. India has the talent that can serve it. So it's not, we have the talent to actually build solutions for them. The second thing we have is the ability to make products because we are building them for our own country and we build those capabilities and we export them all over the world. So I think those two vectors, one is of providing digital services, not just, coding manpower. And the fact that we can sell SaaS solutions and digital solutions across the world. There is a bank which is being launched in the US out of India. You've seen the success of Zoho, Freshworks, and even Zenoti and all these companies across the world. So I think suddenly you find that India can play a very different game in the world when it comes to being in the global supply chain. And that is digital talent. We have millions of engineers who can be reskilled to actually code well. Smart people who can code well, who are living in an ecosystem that's smartphone friendly, mobile first. And we are now, first time we are in a situation where we can lead the revolution. And China is giving us the space to do that. So I think that fundamentally will define a lot of what will happen over the next decade. Girls and with the labor participation of women can fundamentally change. So I keep talking about women who can code. I think girls sitting at home in India can code for anywhere in the world, and that's a massive, massive opportunity for India to grow and our incomes in Indian households to grow and women to participate. So there are fundamentally 3-4 things. If we get our policy right, and even if we don't get our policy right, remember the Infosys, the TCS were built outside the pale of policy. But if policy can support this, frankly, we have a revolution sitting on our hand over the next 10 years.
Thanks, Haresh. Thanks, everyone. It's been a pretty fascinating 1 hour where we have covered a wide variety of subjects. Thank you for your time, and it's been a pleasure talking to all of you, and it's been a pleasure having you on our talk session. On behalf of Amazon Smbhav, I wish you a good day and thank you very much.